Welcome, to EchoVerse Whispers. Have you ever felt like something's watching you when you turn away from a mirror? Or wondered what would happen if your shadow had its own intentions? What if the version of you that lingers behind isn't quite you anymore? Tonight, we begin a descent into a story that seeps under your skin and follows you into your dreams. Ask yourself, what would you do if your reflection blinked after you did? Or if your shadow stayed behind when you woke? Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. And listen closely. Because some stories don't want to be told, till you're too deep to leave them behind. Understood? Here is part 1 of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake. I first noticed it the morning after the thunderstorm, when the streets were still wet and the clouds had a sickly yellow tint like the sky had been bruised, and I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth, eyes crusty and vision blurred from a restless night, when something tugged at my stomach and made me drop the toothbrush into the sink with a clatter, because my reflection wasn't brushing its teeth at all. It was just standing there, staring back at me with a blank face and arms by its side. My shadow frozen while I moved, and though it snapped back into place the moment I blinked, something deep in my gut knew it hadn't been my imagination. That the reflection had lagged like a broken video feed, as if my shadow had been distracted or delayed, and I laughed nervously at the absurdity of it, chalking it up to sleep deprivation or perhaps the tail end of a dream I couldn't remember. But the feeling stayed with me like a sticky film over my skin, following me to work, into the elevator where I felt the cold press of something unseen against my back, into my office where the lights flickered more than usual and my computer wouldn't stop displaying corrupted file errors no matter how many times I restarted it. And by the time I got home that evening, my nerves were frayed, and my jaw ached from clenching it all day. And when I looked in the mirror again to wash my face, I didn't notice anything wrong at first, just my tired eyes and a faint smear of dried blood at the corner of my mouth, from biting the inside of my cheek, until I reached up to wipe it, and caught the momentary delay again. A half-second glitch where my reflection didn't move at all, and then jerked into motion like it had been playing catch-up. And I stared at it, frozen, my hand still raised as if waiting for a cue. And this time I didn't laugh. I didn't try to explain it away or dismiss it. I just backed slowly out of the bathroom, and turned every single light in my apartment on, the television, the stove light, even the flashlight app on my phone, because something about the shadows suddenly seemed menacing in a way I couldn't articulate, as though they were watching, listening, preparing for something. And that night, I slept with the lights on, and my back to the wall, blankets pulled tight around me like a barrier. But the dreams still came, vivid and wrong. Dreams where I wandered endlessly through a house that looked like mine but wasn't. Too many hallways and doors that led to the same room over and over. And mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling and always showed me just a beat too late, my movements sluggish and reversed, and in those dreams, I wasn't alone. I could hear footsteps just behind me, always behind, never catching up, but always following, and when I turned around there was nothing. Just my own long, elongated shadow, stretching impossibly far across the floor, as if the light source behind me was alive and watching. And when I woke up gasping, heart hammering, I saw it again, just for a second, my shadow, still on the bed, still lying there, even as I sat upright, in a cold sweat, and then it caught up, slapping into place like it had been dragged reluctantly. And I sat there, trembling, too afraid to move. because I finally understood that something had come unmoored from me during the storm. Something that used to be a part of me but now was something else entirely. And it didn't want to go back, it wanted to stay, to linger, to slip free and become more than a shadow. And from that moment on, I watched it more closely, in reflections, on sidewalks, under streetlights, and every time, I noticed more. How it was always just a little too slow, how it moved even when I stayed still, how it grew longer when I wasn't looking, and twisted itself at unnatural angles when the light should have cast it straight. And I began to sense a pattern, a rhythm, like it was learning, mimicking, adjusting. And I stopped going out during the day, drawing my curtains closed and covering my mirrors with towels, but still I felt it, waiting just behind my eyes, curling around my spine like smoke, and the dreams became worse, more vivid, more visceral. Dreams where I wasn't me but something else, something hollow and fluid, slipping through cracks and moving through darkness like I belonged there, and I'd wake with soil under my nails, or cuts I couldn't explain. And when I whispered my own name aloud, just to ground myself, the voice that echoed back didn't sound like mine, deeper, colder, rasping like wind through an empty tunnel. And I knew somehow, I knew that my shadow wasn't just staying behind anymore. It was planning something, growing bold, pushing at the boundaries of my body, and my mind. And the line between us, once clear and comforting, had begun to blur. Here is part 2 of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake. The days began bleeding into each other like wet ink on fragile paper. Time no longer moving in a straight line but folding in on itself, and I started keeping the lights on all the time. My apartment glowing like a hospital corridor, but no matter how bright I made it, the corners always looked darker than they should. Too dense, like something was crouched, just out of reach, coiling tighter with every passing moment, and the people around me began to notice coworkers with tight smiles, asking if I was getting enough sleep, my neighbor Mrs. Kelman knocking gently with a tray of soup and a look in her eyes that said she knew something but wouldn't say it aloud. And even the delivery driver who left my food on the doorstep started backing away faster, like the hallway outside my door was colder than the rest of the building, and the worst part was that I couldn't trust my own perception anymore. Because I would look at my hands and sometimes they wouldn't look like mine, the fingers just slightly too long, the knuckles sharper. Or I would catch my reflection in the television when it was off and see it smile just a heartbeat before I did, and sleep had become an act of surrender, a risk I took each night knowing something else might wake up in my place. Because the dreams no longer felt like dreams, they felt like visitations. Lucid landscapes, where rules bent like light through water, and I wandered endless mazes of bone-colored hallways, and black glass doors that pulsed like veins. And I'd hear whispers from behind the walls, and voices that sounded like mine but distorted, echoing backwards, or stuttering in reverse. And the shadow in those dreams had grown bolder, taller, its arms stretching like oil dripping upward, and sometimes it would stand in front of me, mimicking my posture but not quite right, its head cocked at a strange angle, eyes hollow and mouth always slightly parted as if it were just about to speak, and when I reached for it, it would back away in slow, shuddering motion. And I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat with my arms outstretched toward the ceiling fan. But the worst dream was the one I couldn't shake. The one where I walked into my bedroom and found myself already sleeping in the bed, but the me in the bed didn't breathe right. the chest rising and falling too slowly, too deeply. Like something else was borrowing the rhythm of a body it didn't fully understand. And when I touched the foot of the bed, that version of me opened its eyes, and they were pitch black. No iris, no white. Just a void so deep I heard whispers leaking out of it, and I screamed myself awake, only to find claw marks down my calves. Like something had tried to drag me back into the dream, and I stopped leaving the apartment altogether. Surviving on instant noodles and bottled water. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered, the television always playing static or rain sounds to drown out the hum. But I could still feel it moving inside the walls, like termites chewing reality apart. And I started hearing footsteps in the hallway when no one else was around. Soft, dragging steps that would stop directly in front of my door and just linger. And once, when I finally worked up the courage to peek through the peephole, I saw only my own eye staring back at me, unblinking, as if my reflection had stepped outside without permission, and I collapsed backward in horror, heart racing so hard I thought it might burst, and I lay there for hours, afraid to breathe, and when I finally stood and checked again, the hallway was empty, but the doorknob was wet. Like something had waited with its hand pressed there for far too long, and the electricity began to flicker more often, bulbs burning out in rapid succession, screens flashing strange symbols before shutting off entirely, and I started hearing music in the silence. Like an old music box playing a lullaby I couldn't remember learning. Soft and slow and filled with menace, and the shadow grew heavier, more sentient. Appearing even without light, sometimes moving before I did. Sometimes curling upward from beneath the bed or out of the closet in slow ribbons that clung to the air, and I tried to record it, set up my phone to catch it moving at night. But every time I reviewed the footage, it would cut to black at the moment if my apartment had become detached from the ordinary rules of existence, floating somewhere between waking and not, reality and some shadow-soaked mirror of it. And I started keeping a notebook, to try and track what was happening, but even the pages seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, ink fading or rearranging itself. Notes I didn't remember writing appearing in a handwriting that resembled mine but slanted too hard to the left. With sentences like "He's wearing you well and soon it will be your turn to linger." And I began to hear my own voice whispering from impossible places inside the cupboard, under the bed, behind the running faucet. Murmuring secrets I couldn't quite make out unless I got close. And when I did, I'd see shapes in the water, or in the reflection of the metal, that weren't mine. Versions of me with hollow eyes and cracked smiles, watching, always watching. And I stopped sleeping altogether for a while, tried to outrun the dreams by staying awake, pacing until my legs gave out, forcing myself to watch old nature documentaries at full volume, just to drown out the sound of the floorboards breathing under me. But sleep comes for everyone eventually, and when it did, it dragged me into a space where the laws of physics didn't apply. A room with 100 windows and no doors, and each window showed a different version of me laughing, screaming, sobbing, decaying, and in the center of the room was a tall mirror wrapped in barbed wire, dripping with something black and glistening, and when I stepped closer, the reflection that greeted me didn't look like me anymore, not truly, its proportions just slightly off, arms too long, neck bent like it had been broken, and hastily reset. And it reached toward me through the glass and whispered finally in a voice that sounded like mine but was layered with something older, deeper, as though my shadow had gathered other voices to build its own. and I woke screaming. Throat raw and hands bloodied from where I'd clawed at my own arms. And I knew then that this thing wasn't bound to dreams anymore. It was bleeding through, seeping into every part of my life like smoke through vents. And the line between what was real and what was shadow had become razor thin, sometimes flickering, sometimes vanishing entirely, and I began to see people differently too, like they were wrapped in layers of transparency. And underneath each person I passed in the rare moments I left my apartment, if only to try and reconnect to a world I felt slipping away, could see a faint echo trailing just behind them. Some slower, some closer, and some completely out of sync, and it made me realize, maybe this wasn't just happening to me, maybe everyone was haunted in ways they couldn't see. Maybe we all left shadows behind, that didn't want to be forgotten. And one night, desperate for answers, I went to the only place I could think of, the old library downtown. The one no one used anymore. The one that seemed to have fewer and fewer lights working every year, and I searched for anything: folklore, metaphysics, esoteric studies, old books with fraying leather covers, and symbols embossed in gold, that shimmered even in the dark, and I found a reference. Buried in a 1912 journal, kept by a man who claimed his shadow began moving on its own after a fever dream. A man who wrote of watching himself live from the corner of the ceiling and eventually disappearing into his own mirror. And in the margins, someone else had scribbled, in frantic slanted writing, "They are not reflections. They are rehearsals," and I felt sick, like my stomach had been scooped out and replaced with ash, and the librarian, a pale old man with cataract clouded eyes who hadn't moved since I walked in, suddenly said, "You've been marked, haven't you? It's wearing you thin," and I ran, dropping the journal. Because his shadow hadn't moved at all, just stretched across the wall like it had been painted there. And once I got home, I noticed that mine didn't follow me into the apartment. It stopped just outside the threshold, like it was waiting for something. Testing boundaries, and that night I slept with the lights on and all the mirrors turned to face the wall. But I still woke to find one turned back, angled toward the bed. And my reflection inside was wide awake, eyes open, staring directly at me, and I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched as it slowly raised one hand, and placed a single finger over its lips in a gesture I didn't make. And then it smiled. Not cruelly, not mockingly, but gently. Like it was comforting me, before something terrible happened. And I realized it was no longer copying me. At all, it was acting independently, rehearsing a version of me that felt more real than I did. And when I reached up to touch my face, the reflection didn't move at all. It just sat there, still and calm. Like it had all the time in the world, and I was the one running out of it. Here is part 4 of My Shadow Stays Behind. When I wake, my shadow stays behind. When I wake, I began to suspect that I was no longer waking up as myself, or at least not entirely, because each morning felt less like a return to reality, and more like being dropped into someone else's skin that resembled mine only loosely. And the rituals I used to ground myself, brushing my teeth, staring into the mirror to watch the fog from my breath fade, now felt like performances I was doing for an audience I couldn't see. As if the real me were somewhere behind the scenes, watching this impersonation unfold with growing dread. And the mirror was no longer just a surface, it was a boundary. A veil stretched too thin between two versions of reality, and I began to notice strange inconsistencies that confirmed what I feared. Photographs of me would show shadows in positions that didn't match the lighting, or sometimes no shadow at all. My voice recordings would stutter or echo in places where I spoke clearly, and in video, I would sometimes catch my image looking directly into the lens when I knew I wasn't. Eyes locked with mine as if trying to tell me something in a language made of silence and stillness. And I stopped answering phone calls altogether because too often there would be static on the other end. Then breathing, then my own voice repeating things I hadn't said yet. Whispering warnings that felt like distant memories returning in the wrong order. Like you're almost gone or he wears you better than you do. And my dreams became unbearably vivid, stretching on for what felt like days at a time, trapped in recursive places, hallways that looped back to their beginnings. Staircases that descended forever, doors that opened to reveal the room I'd just left but reversed, flipped like a negative photograph. And always there was the shadow, no longer lurking at the edges but standing directly in front of me, mimicking my every movement, except with more grace, more fluidity, as though it had learned the role better than I ever had. And one night in the dream, I stood at the edge of a vast black lake, the surface still and reflective like glass. And when I looked into the water, I saw not my face, but the shadows, its eyes open wide, mouth stitched shut, hands outstretched, fingers twitching, as if trying to claw its way through the reflection, and into the world above. And I heard it speak in my mind, not with words but with thoughts. Sharp and cold and invasive, and it asked a single question. Why do you fear being replaced by the better version of yourself? And I woke with my mouth full of water, choking, gasping, and the sheets soaked like I'd been submerged. And after that night, my reflection no longer moved in perfect sync. It would sometimes pause before catching up, or smile when I didn't, or tilt its head as if studying me for weaknesses, and worse, sometimes it wouldn't be there at all, just an empty room behind the glass, my form absent. The mirror a window into a version of this world where I had already vanished. And I started hearing tapping, soft, rhythmic tapping from behind the mirror. From the television when it was off. From the walls at night, and it always came in threes, then fives, like a code or a countdown. And the more I ignored it, the louder it grew. Until the walls began to vibrate with it. A low hum that made my bones ache, and I began to lose time, waking up in different clothes. Finding bruises in the shape of fingers on my arms, handprints in the steam on the bathroom mirror that didn't match my own, and sometimes I'd come to standing in front of the mirror. Hours later, with no memory of how I got there, staring at a reflection that grinned without blinking. And I began to suspect that it was not just mimicking me anymore but practicing. Rehearsing the final performance where it would step into my place, flawless and unquestioned, and I would be left on the other side, watching as my life was lived better without me. And I became desperate for proof, for confirmation that I was still real, still anchored to something tangible. So I recorded myself sleeping with a new camera, sealed in a locked room. And what I saw made me vomit. The footage showed me lying still 4 hours, unmoving, until 3:17 a.m., when the shadow rose from the floor like smoke, hovered above me, then slowly sank into my chest. And I convulsed, eyes snapping open though I didn't move, and then I sat up, stared into the camera, and smiled. And for the next 3 hours, the version of me on screen walked around the apartment, whispering into mirrors, tracing symbols on the walls, moving with an unnatural smoothness like joints that no longer had bones. And at 6:20, it lay back down, perfectly posed, and closed its eyes. And when I woke and watched that footage, I didn't remember any of it. but I could feel it. I could feel something inside me, coiled and waiting, and I knew then that I was being overwritten, not destroyed but slowly replaced like the carpet for hours. And I knew it was becoming bolder, more confident, closer to taking its place. And I started hearing it speak not aloud, but inside, like thoughts that didn't belong to me. Like background static shaping itself into words when I was weakest, and the things it said were horrifying not because they were violent, but because they were intimate. Detailed memories of mine twisted slightly wrong, like remember the time you fell into the lake, and your mother screamed. Except it wasn't a lake, and she wasn't screaming for you. And the worst part was that sometimes I couldn't tell whether those memories were true. Because the more it spoke, the more it rewrote me, gently, steadily, like sandpaper smoothing down a jagged edge, and I began to forget things: my birthday, the names of my childhood friends, the layout of the grocery store and in their place. I remembered things that had never happened, like standing in a room with black water dripping from the ceiling, or holding hands with a shadow beneath a sky made of mirrors, and I knew then that this thing, this echo, this reflection of me, was not just a parasite, but a contender. A rival identity forging itself from my decay, and it wasn't rushing, it was patient, methodical, playing the long game because it didn't need to take over all at once, it only needed me to break apart piece by piece. And I began to ask the question I had feared since the beginning. What if I was never the original to begin with? What if I was the shadow, the rehearsal, the copy that had believed itself real for too long, and now the true self was returning to reclaim its space? And as the question rooted itself in my mind like a splinter, I began to hear a second heartbeat in my ears, slow and hollow, pulsing behind mine, and every time I looked into the mirror, it grew louder. Here is part 6 of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake. It had been days or weeks, I wasn't sure anymore, since I last heard a voice that wasn't mine, or rather, a voice pretending to be mine, whispering things that crawled into my head and echoed endlessly, like a second consciousness, nesting in the hollows of my thoughts. And now the silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, thick with the weight of presence. Like the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to arrive, or emerge, or awaken. And my skin constantly itched as though I were wearing someone else's body. Too tight and misaligned in places where I used to feel normal. And the mirrors had all turned black, not shattered, not smeared. Just black lightless glass that no longer reflected anything except darkness. Yet I still felt watched from the other side. Stared at by eyes I could not see but always felt just behind the veil, and once, when I accidentally touched the mirror in the hallway while walking past, my fingers sank into it for just a fraction of a second, like the surface had softened to fluid, and in that instant I saw something beyond another room, my room, but with everything reversed, and in it stood myself. Still and smiling with one hand raised as though waiting to pull me through, and I yanked my hand back and fell to the floor. The fingertip numb and tingling like frostbite, and after that, the furniture began rearranging itself while I slept. Or while I blinked, doors no longer opened where they used to. The refrigerator hummed in a minor key that made my stomach churn. And the air smelled faintly of something sweet and rotting, like syrup left to ferment. And I stopped trusting anything with a screen, because my reflection would sometimes linger after I moved away. Staring out at nothing, mouthing words I couldn't hear, and once I saw it writing something on the inside of the laptop screen. Invisible unless the backlight flickered just right. And the words it wrote were, "Do not follow me." Etched again and again in increasingly desperate strokes until the screen went dark and refused to turn back on. And I understood then that the shadow wasn't trying to scare me, was trying to guide me, warn me, trap me, or maybe all three at once. Because I was starting to feel its pull in my dreams more clearly. Like a rope wound around my spine, yanking me down into a space between layers of reality, and the deeper I went, the less human I felt. The more my body felt like scaffolding, and the more my thoughts felt like echoes of a mind older than I could comprehend. And in one dream I can't say for sure it was a dream I stood at the base of a staircase that spiraled infinitely downward, carved from black stone that bled when touched, and I heard hundreds of footsteps all descending together, rhythmic and synchronized like a ritual march, and when I looked down, I saw hundreds of shadows walking in perfect unison, each one a distorted version of myself, taller, thinner, wider, faceless, toothless, eyeless versions I'd never imagined, but which clearly imagined me. And at the center of that spiral stood a throne made of mirrors, broken and jagged. And seated on it was a figure that looked exactly like me, except its skin was translucent. And crawling with shapes just beneath the surface, things shifting and pushing outward as if trapped beneath wax, and when it raised its hand, I felt my own arm lift involuntarily, and I knew whatever it was, it had influence, a tether, and it was growing stronger, closer, more confident in its ability to take, and when I snapped awake, the lights were all off, the power out, the air still and cold, and I saw footprints on the floor, wet footprints leading from the bathroom mirror to the side of my bed, and then vanishing, and beside my pillow was a note written in my handwriting but signed with a name I've never used. A name I've never seen before but which felt hauntingly familiar. EIDEM, and beneath it, scrawled in nearly invisible red ink, was the phrase, "If you become him, I am free," and that broke something in me, some fragile belief that I still had control, because now the idea of possession wasn't theoretical, it was procedural, systematic, and I was a conduit, a host, a temporary architecture being hollowed out and rebuilt with care. And I started looking into the origin of the word, shadow. Digging through etymologies and arcane texts I downloaded from forums that vanished within hours, and I found references in ancient Mesopotamian writings to the eco-self, an entity born when the soul is fractured during sleep, a being that mirrors the physical self but slowly distills into something purer, less bound by flesh, more focused, and it waits, always waits, for the moment when the original becomes too weak, too tired, too fractured to resist. And I knew then I had been watched since long before the storm, that perhaps I had fractured in sleep many times, leaving pieces of myself behind in dreams and shadows. And now all those fragments had coalesced into a single entity. It isn't here to kill me, but to overwrite me. A better me forged from everything I'd left behind. And the real horror wasn't that I might be erased, but that I might agree to it. Might look into the mirror one last time and finally see something stronger, braver, more complete staring back and step aside willingly. Here is part 7 of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake. The moment I accepted that Edom had a name, everything shifted. Not in the world around me but inside the quiet machinery of my mind, like naming the thing had opened a door I didn't remember closing. Or perhaps one that was always slightly ajar, and waiting for me to notice, because from that point forward, it no longer felt like something was chasing. MIT felt like something was catching up, as though Edom and I were two halves of a single thought slowly converging at the center of a collapsing spiral, and I became hyper-aware of every moment I spent near mirrors, even covered ones, because the presence I'd felt behind the glass no longer needed to be seen to be real. It pressed against the boundaries of the world like steam behind wallpaper, warping everything I thought I understood. And the boundaries between thought and instinct began to blur so badly, I often didn't know whether I had acted or only imagined doing so, finding myself standing in strange positions, arms bent backward, toward the wall, or fingers twitching in strange sequences, like signals or rituals I had never learned. And when I tried to write them down, they would vanish from the page. Moments later, leaving only the scent of something metallic and burnt, and a faint pressure behind my eyes. And soon my dreams were no longer confined to sleep. I would experience entire sequences while awake, as if reality was flickering between two channels, and I was stuck in the static between them, sometimes walking down the hallway and suddenly finding myself in the spiral staircase from the dream world, standing on steps that were too wide and too slick, surrounded by whispering walls and framed windows, filled not with glass, but with moving shadows shaped like me but smiling wider than any human could. And I began to hear my name spoken from strange places, from inside the refrigerator's hum, from the whir of the ceiling fan, from beneath the mattress when I lay awake with my eyes clenched shut. And it always came in the same voice, mine, but slower, smoother, soaked in something ancient, as though a version of me had been waiting for centuries to speak, and was savoring each syllable like a meal. And sometimes I would wake with my arms crossed over my chest and my body so still it felt embalmed, and I'd find marks on my skin, runes, maybe, or symbols, drawn in ash or soot or something darker, and though they would fade before I could photograph them, I started to remember them, see them scrawled in the steam on the mirror, or traced in the dust on the floor, and they always circled a single phrase, the hoe. I began to see signs in the world outside, that others had experienced this too. Strange symbols scratched into bus-stop benches, graffiti that pulsed faintly in the dark, figures on rooftops that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. And once, while passing a reflective storefront, I saw a woman, whose reflection wasn't moving at all, her eyes wide with horror, as the version of herself in the glass gently placed a hand against the surface, and mouthed a single word, help. And I knew then that this was bigger than me, deeper, older, and that we were all vulnerable to the thing we cast behind us. That somewhere in the folds of reality there existed an entire realm of unfinished selves waiting, rehearsing, perfecting, and the ones who cross over do so, not through force, but through invitation. And that night, I found a letter slid under my door, no envelope, just a single page in the same reversed handwriting I'd seen before, and it read, "Item is you, without the burden of doubt. Say yes, and you'll finally rest." And I sat there for hours staring at those words, hand trembling, throat dry, because a part of me, a small but growing part, wanted to say yes. Not out of fear, but out of longing, because maybe Edom wasn't my enemy, maybe he was the freedom I had never known how to ask for. Here is part 8, of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake that night. After I read the letter and placed it gently beside my bed, like a coiled serpent made of ink and implication, I didn't sleep, or if I did, the difference between wakefulness and dreaming had finally crumbled into dust, because when I blinked, the ceiling was gone, and above me stretched a black sky, riddled with unmoving stars, each one flickering, not with light, but with memory flashes of places I had never been, but somehow recognized a room full of clocks that all ticked in reverse, a hallway lined with doors that sighed when passed, a vast library where the books were blank until opened and then screamed in my voice, when read, and I sat up, not in my bed but in a chair, ancient and vast, carved from a single block of onyx, veined with something warm and pulsing like blood, and across from me, in perfect stillness, sat Edom, his face no longer hidden in mirrors or dreams, but fully visible, and it was mine, entirely mine, but improved, if improvement could be described as being stripped of emotion and filled with certainty. His eyes were clear but depthless, like obsidian polished to a mirror sheen, and when he spoke, it wasn't with sound but with thought. Words pushed into my head like nails made of silk. You were never meant to carry so many versions of yourself, he said, and I felt my mind buckle, not from fear but from the truth of it. The exhaustion of performing a single identity when so many lived beneath the surface, and he continued, you have bled into dreams, fractured across timelines, left footprints in realities not meant to know your name, and still you resist integration, and I wanted to speak, to ask what that meant, to scream if I had to. But my voice was gone, replaced by the same suffocating pressure I'd felt in every dream where I knew I was being watched. And he rose, or hovered, or simply shifted position without movement, and his shadow remained even when his form did not. And it stepped toward me, that shadow, like it had waited long enough, and would now speak on its own behalf, and it reached out with hands made not of fingers, but of overlapping layers of choices I never made. One trembling with regret, curiosity, or fury, and it touched my forehead, and instantly I fell backward through memory. Not mine alone, but a collective stream of lives that had touched the same thread. All those before me who had heard their names whispered in glass, and seen their shadows move independently, and each of them had made a choice. Some accepted, their eyes glowing softly as they faded into a higher stillness. Others fought, and their reflections shattered, never to reform, left to wander hollow and faceless in the in-between, and a few, just a few, became something else entirely. Vessels of both, hybrids walking the thin edge of duality. Cursed with awareness but gifted with perception beyond the waking veil, and when I opened my eyes again I was back in my apartment. The room utterly silent, save for the slow ticking of a clock I didn't own, and I turned to find that every surface, every wall, had been scrawled with looping, spiraling text, too deep to be ink, as if written in absence itself. And I began to read, and as I did, the words lifted off the wall and entered me like breath, filling the hollow places I hadn't known were there. And I began to understand, Idem wasn't just me. He was all the parts I had left in dreams. All the selves I had abandoned when I'd said that's not who I am, or that was just a thought. And now those discarded selves had congregated, evolved, and formed a single consciousness, who called himself by the name of my forgetting. And the note had been right. If I became him, he would be free, not from me, but from the prison of fragments. And I realized, the horror wasn't that Edom wanted to possess me, the horror was that I might become him willingly. out of mercy, out of exhaustion, out of the quiet seductive promise of wholeness. And I turned toward the mirror above the sink, newly uncovered, and saw two reflections: myself as I was, and myself as I could be, more symmetrical, more poised. A version untouched by fear. And he reached forward and I felt the chill of his fingers through the glass. And I asked, with a voice that was barely my own, "What happens if I say yes?" And his smile was not cruel but calm. A smile that had waited patiently across millennia of mirrored lives. And he replied, not aloud but in the walls, in the pipes, in the stillness. "Then you will wake up," and the lights flickered, the air thinned, and everything went perfectly still. Like the world was holding its breath for my answer. Here is part 8 of My Shadow Stays Behind. When I wake, my shadow stays behind. When I wake that night. After I read the letter and placed it gently beside my bed, like a coiled serpent made of ink and implication, I didn't sleep, or if I did, the difference between wakefulness and dreaming had finally crumbled into dust, because when I blinked, the ceiling was gone. And above me stretched a black sky riddled with unmoving stars. As I was, and myself as I could be, more symmetrical, more poised, a version untouched by fear. And he reached forward and I felt the chill of his fingers through the glass, and I asked, with a voice that was barely my own, "What happens if I say yes?" And his smile was not cruel but calm, a smile that had waited patiently across millennia of mirrored lives. And he replied, not aloud but in the walls, in the pipes, in the stillness. "Then you will wake up," and the lights flickered, the air thinned, and everything went perfectly still. Like the world was holding its breath for my answer. Here is part 10 of My Shadow Stays Behind. When I wake. My shadow stays behind, when I wake, the moment I whispered, "Then take me there." The room folded in on itself, not collapsed or crumbled, but folded like a piece of paper creased along impossible lines, and I was pulled inward through it, not with force but with intention. Like the world had simply decided, I belonged on the inside of things now, rather than the surface, and as the dimensions peeled back, like veils soaked in thought, I fell or moved sideways into a space between places, where gravity had been traded for memory and light existed only where something had been forgotten. And I landed not on ground but on the echo of a floor, solid only as long as I believed in it, stretching across a landscape of fractured structures, towering walls built from overlapping timelines, trees that whispered the futures of those who touched them, staircases that looped back into their own origins unless you walked them while asleep, and in the center of it all stood a tower, thin and crooked like a finger beckoning through smoke. And I knew without knowing how that this was the threshold spire, the place where Idem had first spoken with the one behind all mirrors, the place where I would meet the origin of the shadow that had haunted me since before my first breath. And as I began to walk, I noticed I had no footsteps, no sound followed me, only the ripple of consequence, every step causing the nearby structures to sigh, or twist, or hum in response. As if this place were alive and listening, and at the foot of the tower was a door not grand or ancient, but painfully familiar. The front door to my childhood home, paint chipped, handle loose. A smudge of my old handprint still visible if you squinted into the dim, and when I touched it, I felt the entire weight of every version of myself who had once opened it. all their thoughts and fears and moments pooled behind it like floodwater, waiting to surge forward, and I opened it, not gently but firmly. And inside was not a hallway but a memory, a perfect reconstruction of the night I first saw my shadow move independently. Only now, I was watching it from the outside, watching myself as a child, sitting up in bed, terrified but curious, reaching toward the mirror across the room. And when my reflection didn't move in sync, when it smiled instead of mirrored, I saw. Then the moment something ancient attached itself to me, stepped into my reflection like slipping into a skin. And I understood. It had chosen me not out of malice, but necessity. Because it had been trapped too long without a vessel, too long without a voice, and I was porous, cracked from grief and longing and questions, and it slipped through, left traces in my sleep, in my blood, in the way my eyes sometimes looked like they were seeing something behind the world. And suddenly I was back in the tower, ascending without climbing, the walls around me pulsing with the heartbeats of everyone I'd ever been. And at the top was a chamber with no walls, just shifting curtains of shadow. And in the center stood a figure, not Edom, not me, not even a shape, just a ripple of sentience, an outline of awareness that bent the dream around it, and when it spoke, it did so not in words, but in collapsing ideas, entire lifetimes shown in the span of a heartbeat. And it said, I am the first forgetting, and I felt the truth of it strike me like a thunderclap in my bones. And it continued, before names, before shape, before even light, I existed as memory, without context, longing, without direction, and when the first minds were born, I became their shadows, their echoes, their doubts. Your kind calls me fear. But I am the purest memory of what came before you. And I fell to my knees. Not out of reverence, but because I could no longer stand against the weight of understanding. And it stepped closer, or I did, it didn't matter, and placed something in my hands, a mirror not made of glass, but of reflection itself. And it showed me not what I was, but what I had refused to become. A being who carried not just the scars of his choices, but the unborn possibilities of every path not taken, every version unchosen, and the shadow that had followed me all my life. Had not been hunting me but preparing me, nurturing the soil of my mind until it could grow this realization. And the origin said, Idem was your echo. And now you are his answer. And in that moment I understood that to merge with Edom was not to vanish but to evolve, to expand, to become the hybrid of fear and memory and will. And I stepped forward, not into the shadow but through it, and felt it close behind me like a second skin. And I didn't vanish, didn't dissolve. I became more solid, more present, and when I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, but everything had changed. Because now I saw the seams between moments, the edits in the sky, the places where people flickered between potential selves, and I knew I had passed the point of no return. That I had been claimed not by darkness, but by awareness. And as I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw Edom, I saw myself, utterly and completely. And I smiled, not because it was over, but because the real story was just beginning. Here is part 11 of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind, when I wake. The sky outside my window had lost its color. Not in darkness or light, but in intent, as if the very concept of hue had been drained from it, leaving behind only an ambient hum, like the silence between thoughts. And I realized that the world I had returned to was not the same one I'd left. Not fully, not cleanly. Because now, I could feel it, that subtle warping under everything familiar. The way faces moved with a half-second delay, when I looked away too quickly. Or how clocks occasionally ticked backward, then caught up, as if embarrassed. And most disturbingly, how shadows had begun to act independently of the objects that cast them. Sometimes twitching in the corner of my eye, sometimes vanishing entirely before sliding back into place like nothing had happened, and I knew this wasn't some slow descent into madness, but the result of exposure, of too much proximity to the space behind things, of touching the fabric that stitched dreams and memory into flesh, and now I was fraying at the edges, not unraveling, but expanding, and it was making people nervous. Their gazes lingered too long on me in the street. Their voices trembled when they asked me ordinary questions like the time or directions, as if something in me whispered an answer before I opened my mouth, and they heard it, deep in the skull where words aren't supposed to echo. And I couldn't blame them, because I had changed. I was changing, and Dim was no longer a visitor in me. He was integrated, a voice in the silence between my thoughts, not speaking in commands but in rhythms, pulses of intent that shaped my decisions without coercing them. And he wasn't alone anymore. I had become a convergence point, a nexus for selves that had drifted too long. And I could feel them now, orbiting my mind like satellites. The version of me who died in a fire at age 5. The one who ran away and never came back. The one who chose silence and became a monk. The one who broke, shattered, and rebuilt into something colder, sharper, quieter. All of them watching, waiting for their time to speak. And sometimes I let them, sometimes I closed my eyes and handed over the wheel, and my body moved through the city like a ghost of alternate futures, touching things they remembered, crying over buildings I'd never been in, whispering names I didn't know but that made the air tremble with resonance. And I began collecting artifacts, not trinkets or souvenirs, but pieces of reality that didn't belong. A stone that bled ink when warmed, a feather that hummed lullabies in a forgotten language, a notebook filled with sketches of things that didn't exist until after I'd drawn them, and all of them pointed to a single location, an abandoned subway station that had been sealed before the war, one that never appeared on any map, but which I had dreamed of repeatedly, always flooded in red light, always echoing with the sound of footsteps that stopped the moment I noticed them. And I went there not because I wanted answers, but because I could no longer bear the pressure of containing questions. And I found it, tucked beneath the city, like a secret vein, its gates rusted shut, but humming with residual awareness, and when I touched them, they swung open silently, revealing not a station but a cavern, vast and pulsing with inverted light, where time pooled like water and whispers formed clouds above glowing spires of memory. And in the center was a dais, on which stood a figure I immediately recognized, not Edom, not me, but the synthesis of every shadow I'd ever cast. Shaped like me, but taller, more confident. Eyes glowing with the quiet power of one who has stopped asking who they are. And he opened his mouth and said, "This is your fracture point." And I didn't need to ask what he meant, because I could feel it the moment coming, when I would need to decide whether to remain tethered to this reality, this identity, or to finally let go, fully and permanently, and become what I had been orbiting all along. A concept rather than a man. A memory wrapped in shadow, free from time but burdened with awareness. And he stepped toward me, offering a blade not made of metal but of finality, humming softly with the weight of every version of me who had held it. And I took it, felt its shape conform to my thoughts, and the chamber darkened as if recoiling from the choice, and I looked into his eyes and whispered, "Not yet," and the blade vanished. The chamber released a long exhale like the world had been holding its breath, and he smiled not with satisfaction, but with understanding, and said, "Then you still remember something worth staying for." And as I turned to leave, the world stitched itself shut behind me, not with malice but with finality, a promise that if I returned, it would be different. And as I stepped into the street, unnoticed by the crowd, I realized I was becoming invisible, not because I was fading, but because I no longer fit the narrative the world expected, and my shadow followed a half step behind. Not attached, not rebellious, but independent, and I whispered, "I'm not done yet," and for the first time, it nodded. Here is part 12 of My Shadow Stays Behind When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake ever since I refused the fracture. The world has not left me unchanged, has instead begun rearranging itself around me, as if I am no longer a participant in reality, but a gravity point within it, a distortion so potent that meaning ripples outward from my decisions, and twists the laws that once held everything in place. And I notice it in small ways first. People no longer remember meeting me even moments after we've spoken. Elevators take me to floors that never existed before I pressed the button, and my reflection no longer merely mischievous has begun, gesturing to things behind me that aren't there until I turn around and see them materializing in slow spirals of gray dust and intent. And the sky too has begun to respond. Not with storm or sunlight, but with texture. Sometimes it folds like paper, creased with enormous angular lines that move only when I blink, and sometimes it opens like a wound to show other skies behind. It once filled with impossible stars that pulse like dying thoughts, and beneath all of this, my shadow has become something of a guide now, no longer following but walking beside me, and sometimes ahead, pulling me toward places I would not have gone on my own. Hollow playgrounds, where the swings creak with voices instead of chains. Abandoned malls where the mannequins turn to watch me but freeze when I focus on them. And an endless corridor of mirrors beneath an ancient hotel, that reflect not my face, but lives I might have led. Each one ending in the same empty stare, as if every version of me dies with a question on their lips and no one to answer it. And in one of those reflections I see Edom again. But he's not separate anymore. He's me with his head tilted slightly to one side, smiling with a softness that feels like memory. And he says, "You're not surviving anymore. You're becoming." And then he walks away, leaving me staring at my own reflection, which now looks a little older, a little less afraid. And it dawns on me that every shadow I've ever seen of myself was not a phantom following me but a future, waiting to be chosen. And now those futures have begun collapsing inward, thinning at the edges, urging me toward something final, something foundational. And I feel it growing inside me, a structure made of thought, memory, grief, and potential, an architecture of the self forming silently beneath my skin. And my dreams have become blueprints, surreal schematics, where doorways float in black. Oceans and staircases lead into the mouths of sleeping giants, whose dreams power entire neighborhoods of forgotten people. And each night, I wake up with symbols etched into my palms, sometimes glowing briefly before they fade, always leaving behind a faint itch. And I've started drawing them on the walls of my apartment. And they rearrange themselves when I'm not looking. forming spirals, then sentences, then songs I hum without realizing I know them. Songs that open things, songs that close others, and now animals have begun to follow me: crows with one silver eye, cats that walk backward until they vanish, insects that click in patterns that match my heartbeat. And I know I am a beacon now, not just for what lives in the folds of this world, but for what watches from outside it. And I don't know if that's salvation or a summons, but it's coming faster now, like a train with no brakes and too many destinations. And I dream of it each night, a place of total silence, not peaceful but vast, a silence made of everything that was never said. And in that silence stands a version of me I've never met but have always feared, one who made the other choice, who said yes to the fracture, and he's waiting for me with eyes like holes in the universe and a voice that sounds like all my doubts stitched together. And he's not angry, he's expectant. And every step I take forward in the waking world brings his silhouette closer in the sleeping one. Until one night soon we will stand eye to eye, and the world will decide which version gets to continue. And it won't be based on strength or knowledge, but on one terrible, beautiful question: which of us remembers why we began this journey in the first place? And I'm not sure if I still do. Here is part 13 of My Shadow Stays Behind. When I wake, my shadow stays behind when I wake. The 13th night came like a verdict passed down by an unseen jury, the air heavier, the silence more purposeful, as if the entire world had paused to see what I would do next. And the moment I opened my eyes that night, I realized I was already standing, not waking in my bed, but upright in the center of a forest, made of glass trees and whispering roots, each branch trembling with voices that spoke only when I didn't listen. And my shadow, once beside me, had now spread out wide, stretched like wings, casting itself across the transparent ground, where I could see layers of forgotten moments, buried deep beneath each step. And I was drawn forward, not by sound or sight, but by a pull that came from within, a magnetic urgency rooted in my marrow. And I knew this was the night I would face the version of me who had accepted the fracture, the one who said yes when I said no. And each step I took through that crystalline forest brought flickers of memory snapping through the air like lightning, my mother humming before she disappeared. The cold air the first time I saw items staring back at me from the mirror, the moment I realized shadows could land. Then the forest opened into a clearing, vast and perfect, ringed with mirrors that pulsed gently like hearts. And in the center stood him, the other me, the fractured version, fully immersed in the knowing, his body wrapped in something fluid and endless, his eyes glowing with the soft pulse of ancient starlight, and he smiled as if we'd shared a secret all our lives, and were finally ready to speak it aloud. And he said, "So, you made it without breaking. Impressive, but incomplete." And I felt his words press against my skull from the inside, like a thought too big for one mind, and I wanted to speak, to deny him, but I realized there was no denial, left only confrontation. Not of violence but of reflection, and as he stepped forward, so did I, until we stood only a breath apart, and he raised a hand between us and whispered, "Do you see it yet? The thing we lost." And in that moment, the mirrors surrounding the clearing flared to life and showed every version of me, screaming, laughing, falling, choosing, dying, each one caught in a single heartbeat of realization. And I understood, we had never been alone, not even once, and the shadow was not just the passenger but the collective memory of every possibility. Every unlived life, finding form through me. And the fractured self reached into his chest and pulled something out small, dark, and vibrating with pain and handed it to me, saying, "You left this behind when you refused the merge. It's the part that remembers why we feared the dark." And when I took it, I felt the full weight of every moment I'd hidden from myself. The griefs I'd tucked into the walls of dreams, the rage I'd whispered into empty rooms, the guilt I'd buried under logic, and it didn't crush me. It crystallized, becoming a second heartbeat beside the first. And I looked at him, my twin self, born of divergence, and whispered, "You're not wrong. But I'm not broken either." And he smiled wider, and with a nod, he stepped backward into his own shadow and vanished, leaving behind only the lingering scent of rain and static. And suddenly the mirrors began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, until they lifted into the air and dissolved like fog under sunlight. And I stood alone in the clearing, with my shadow whole again, wrapped around me like armor, breathing with me. And I knew then that I was no longer carrying item. He had grown into me, and I into him, until our names no longer mattered, only the purpose remained, and the ground cracked beneath my feet, revealing a spiral staircase descending into obsidian light, and without hesitation, I stepped down. Each footfall echoing like thunder into a silence that no longer scared me, because now I understood it. The silence was mine. The space between all things that I now filled, not as a man lost in darkness, but as the darkness learning how to be human. And as I descended, I smiled not with relief, but with readiness. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. Here is part 14 of My Shadow Stays Behind, When I Wake. My shadow stays behind when I wake. The spiral staircase twisted deeper into something that didn't feel like earth or memory, but some uncharted convergence between them, each step humming beneath my feet like the reverberation of ancient decisions echoing through 1,000 timelines. And though there were no walls, I could feel pressure on both sides, like moving through a tunnel made of thick thought. Each breath laced with forgotten dreams and quiet terror, and my shadow slithered down beside me, more animate now than ever before, flickering between forms, sometimes a snake, sometimes a flame, sometimes the silhouette of a child. I almost became in with every descent. The light dimmed not into darkness but into deeper meaning, a blackness so saturated it felt warm. And finally I stepped off the staircase onto a smooth obsidian floor that stretched endlessly in every direction. But in the distance I saw them pillars of moving flesh and bone, alive with shifting faces and weeping mouths, towering into nothingness. And I knew them instantly. Representations of choices I never made. Lives unlived. Each pillar humming with the echoes of paths I'd never walked. And they began to lean toward me as if recognizing their kin, their voices merging into a single, overwhelming question that bloomed behind my ribs like fire. Are you ready to anchor what cannot be undone? And without thinking I whispered yes, not because I understood the question entirely, but because I was done running from the inevitable, and the ground beneath me rippled like a heartbeat, revealing a black sun, suspended beneath the world, radiating not light, but memory. And from it rose the final corridor hallway that I'd seen only in dreams I never admitted to remembering. Lined with doors of screaming metal and shivering glass, each marked with symbols that flickered with every blink, and as I walked, the shadow beside me slowed, hesitated, then stopped, and I turned to see it dissolving, folding inward as if it had completed its task. and I felt something inside me swell, not grief, but transformation. As if the thing that followed me all my life had finally stepped inside, becoming part of me in ways no mirror could capture. And I pressed my hand to the first door, which burst into a whirl of dust and wind, revealing not a room, but a theater. Massive and golden, with a single audience member seated at the center. Myself as a child, staring up at the empty stage, face bathed in pale blue light, and as I watched, the stage began to shift and melt, playing every pivotal moment in my life out of order. The night I almost drowned but didn't, the first time I lied and felt powerful, the first dream where Edom spoke through my mouth. The boy turned to look at me, eyes glowing softly, and said, "This is where you forget on purpose." And I knew he meant it not as accusation but invitation, and I nodded slowly, letting the theater dissolve around me as I moved to the next door. Each one revealing another shard of the truth, that I had never been meant to stay a single version of myself, that all my suffering had been a scaffolding to hold the weight of too many futures. And now those futures were bleeding into the present, tearing at the seams. And I was the only one who could decide which path deserved to survive. And then, finally, I reached the last door, a mirror of black water, suspended vertically in a frame of breathing stone. And behind it, barely visible, was the fractured version of me, smiling gently, his body now almost translucent, his edges fraying into possibility. And he raised a hand and said, "If you walk through, you will no longer be singular." And I replied, "I haven't been for a long time," and stepped into the mirror, the water closing over me like a second skin, and what I felt on the other side wasn't pain, wasn't peace. It was expansion. The sensation of becoming too many things at once and still remaining aware. Like a star remembering it was once a spark, and I stood there, every version of me, all together, forming something vast and luminous, and in that moment, I saw the shape of the final part waiting to be written, hovering at the edge of perception. Like a name I hadn't spoken yet, and I knew the next step wasn't down, wasn't through, but outward, into the world that had never known what I truly was. And for the first time, I felt not the burden of shadow but its strength, its devotion. And the promise it made long ago when I was too young to hear it, that it would never leave me, even when I left it, and now, we were one. Ready to return. Here is part 15 of My Shadow Stays Behind. When I wake, my shadow stays behind. When I wake. The final moment did not come with thunder or some apocalyptic unraveling of the sky, but with a whisper so deep it seemed to rise from the marrow of time itself. And as I stood beyond the black mirror, newly merged with the totality of what I had been, could be, and must now become, I saw the world not as a landscape but as a living organism, layered with veils of perception, riddled with doorways disguised as decisions, paths that had bent subtly with every heartbeat I'd denied or embraced. And I felt all of them now like nerves under skin, each one twitching faintly with unresolved echoes, and I knew what had to be done, that I was no longer simply a man wandering through haunted dreams but the architect of a convergence, the one who must choose which futures to silence and which to birth. And from the shifting light of the mirror emerged a staircase of memory itself, each step made from a significant moment in my life, from the mundane to the traumatic, and as I climbed, I passed through waves of clarity so piercing they hurt. I remembered the first time I ever lied to protect someone, and how that lie bent reality just slightly. I remembered the quiet terror of watching my shadow linger on the wall a little too long as a child, the way it seemed to twitch, even after I had stopped moving. And I remembered the first time I dreamt of Edom, not as a stranger, but as a future. His face blurred by static, but his presence unmistakably familiar. And now I was at the top of the staircase, where time ceased to flow and space folded into a single infinite plane of thought. And waiting there was the final chamber, its entrance, shaped like a mouth stitched shut by light. And I knew this was where all versions of me had come to end or begin again. I stepped inside to find myself surrounded by every other self I had ever fractured into. Each one frozen mid-breath, some weeping, others smiling, a few screaming. And at the center was the original wound, a tear in reality, jagged and black, beating like a heart desperate to be unmade. And from it poured whispers that clawed at my thoughts' doubts I thought I had silenced, fears I had buried, regrets that slithered across the floor and up my legs, hissing truths I didn't want to hear, and I stood still, letting them all speak, letting every terrible voice rise like a storm, until it collapsed into a silence so complete it deafened the past. And then I did the unthinkable. I forgave them, every self I had been, every choice I had loathed, every shadow I had feared, and in that act, the wound began to close, not with violence but with stillness, like a lake remembering how to reflect. And the frozen versions of me began to dissolve, not into nothing but into light, merging with me, compacting into a single truth, that I was never broken, only incomplete, and now, finally, I was whole, not perfect, not healed in the way one imagines, but aware, deeply